They shipped the bones to Washington. Nobody ever saw them again. May 1883. A freight manifest confirms skeletal remains from West Virginia burial mounds reached the Smithsonian's doorstep. No catalog entry was ever made, and this was not an isolated case. From Peru's Paracas necropolis to Nevada's Lovelock Cave, burial sites have yielded remains that do not match any known ancient population. Skulls with 25% greater cranial volume, single parietal plates, and DNA haplogroups found nowhere in the surrounding region. The anomalies were measurable. So why did the evidence keep disappearing? In 1928, Peruvian archaeologist Julio C. Tello directed excavations at the Huari Cayan necropolis on the Paracas Peninsula, uncovering over 300 skulls that would soon draw international attention. The skeletal remains stood out immediately. Field notebooks from Tello's team describe crania with a striking elongation. Vaults extended far beyond the normal human range, and in some cases the skulls were measured and weighed as much as 60% heavier than typical modern specimens. Unpublished lab notes and museum records, preserved in Lima and in the custody of the Paracas History Museum, cite cranial volumes up to 25% above the average adult capacity. These figures, while often repeated in informal channels, have not been systematically published in peer-reviewed journals, leaving a gap between the raw measurements and their scientific context. Among the most unusual features, several skulls were recorded with a single parietal plate, a trait absent from standard human anatomy, which normally presents two. This anomaly, noted in both field sketches and later digital scans, has not been conclusively explained through known cultural practices or pathology. The museum's restricted access policy further complicates any outside review. Since the early 2000s, the Paracas History Museum, now under private stewardship, has limited external researchers to a small subset of the collection, citing conservation concerns and incomplete documentation of original excavation lots. Genetic analysis, though limited, has added another layer to the puzzle. A single mitochondrial DNA result, drawn from a bone sample under controlled conditions, identified haplogroup U2E. This lineage is rare in South America and more commonly associated with populations in Western Eurasia. The full chain of custody for this sample, however, is not publicly available, and the data remain unpublished outside of museum press releases and online forums. The absence of a comprehensive peer-reviewed dataset, combined with the museum's tight control over physical access, has left the strongest physical deviations on record as both a source of intrigue and a barrier to definitive answers. In the spring of 1912, a team from the University of California, Berkeley, began their first systematic excavation at Lovelock Cave in Nevada. The field diaries from this and a follow-up expedition in 1924 record a remarkable assemblage. More than 10,000 artifacts emerged from the cave's layered deposits, including finely woven baskets, fishing gear, and a wide array of bone tools. Among the most discussed finds were mummified human remains, some with hair that retained a reddish pigment, a detail cataloged in the original field notes, but left unexplained. The hair's color, noted in the inventories from 1912 and 1924, has since been attributed by some researchers to post-mortem chemical changes rather than to a naturally red-haired population. Yet the observation persists in both archival and popular accounts. One object stands out in the archaeological record: a pair of woven sandals measuring 15 inches in length. The field team carefully measured and photographed these sandals, noting their size exceeded any known from the region's prehistoric contexts. If proportioned to the foot of the wearer, the sandals would suggest a person of unusual height, perhaps approaching 9 feet by modern standards. The sandals, along with other oversized items, were logged and transferred to the Hearst Museum of Anthropology, where they remain part of the permanent collection. Yet no corresponding skeletal remains of such stature have been conclusively identified among the curated bones. The mummified individuals, while sometimes described as tall, fall within the upper range for Native American populations of the era, according to osteometric tables preserved in the Berkeley archives. The Lovelock assemblage also includes a series of artifacts that complicate easy interpretation. Large handprint impressions in clay, unusually robust bone tools, and textile fragments with patterns not matched in neighboring cultures. These items are well documented in the expedition catalogs but have not been systematically analyzed for their implications. The field documentation is thorough, yet the context of several finds was disrupted by commercial guano mining, which removed much of the upper deposit before archaeological controls were established. This loss of context, combined with the absence of peer-reviewed analysis of the most anomalous remains, leaves open questions about the population that once used the cave. The Lovelock finds, especially the red pigmented hair and outsized footwear, remain a touchstone for debate, offering measurable anomalies that resist easy classification and invite comparison to oral traditions yet to be addressed. On May 12, 1883, a rail shipment from the Kanawha Valley arrived in Washington, D.C., bearing a cargo described in its manifest as large skeletal remains and associated burial goods. The paperwork, issued by the Bureau of Ethnology, meticulously listed the crate contents, the field agent's name, and the precise point of departure. The shipment's route, documented in the Baltimore and Ohio Railway's freight logs, aligns with a field report excerpt, noting the bones' unusual size and the scientific value assigned to them by the collecting team. Yet, when researchers examine the Smithsonian's accession ledgers for that period, the entry for this batch is missing. The public catalog, which should record the crate's arrival and its assignment to a storage location or display case, contains no mention of the Kanawha remains. Internal correspondence from the Bureau's registrar in April of that year authorizes the transfer under the Anthropology Act of 1881, but no follow-up inventory or specimen log traces the material past its arrival in Washington, D.C. This gap is not a matter of clerical error. The freight manifest survives, stamped and signed. The field agent's report survives, describing the excavation and the careful packing of the bones for rail transport. But the official records at the point of receipt are silent. No accession number, no shelf location, no subsequent analysis or exhibition. The bones, documented up to the moment of their arrival, simply vanish from the institutional record. The Kanawha case stands as a concrete example of an archival trail that ends not with a published study or a public display, but with a missing ledger entry. The physical evidence, once tangible, measured, and shipped under official oversight, disappears into administrative silence. The unanswered question is not only what was found, but why the documentation stops at the door. In the ancient texts that first gave rise to the Nephilim narrative, the language itself sets the boundaries for what later generations would imagine. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4, preserved in the Hebrew Masoretic text, describes a time when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. The offspring, called Nephilim, are described as heroes of old, men of renown. The Greek Septuagint translates Nephilim as gigantes, introducing the idea of giants, while the Samaritan Pentateuch uses a variant that highlights their extraordinary stature. Early interpreters, from Josephus to the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls, read these lines as evidence of divine beings mingling with humans, producing a hybrid race outside the known order. Numbers 13, verse 33 adds another layer, reporting that the Israelite spies encountered the Anakim, a people great and tall, the height of whom was like a cedar. Later, Jewish commentary links the Anakim directly to the Nephilim, reinforcing the image of beings whose size and presence set them apart from ordinary populations. The cedar simile, trees that could reach over 100 feet, was not a literal measurement, but a marker of something beyond the familiar. The Book of Enoch, preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts and fragments from Qumran, offers the most detailed expansion. Here the story grows, as 200 watchers, a class of angels, descend to earth, take human wives, and father the Nephilim. These giants, according to Enoch, bring violence and forbidden knowledge, prompting a catastrophic flood. The text gives a specific number, anchoring the myth in a framework that later traditions would echo and reinterpret. Dr. James C. Vanderkamp, a scholar of ancient Semitic texts, points out that the original Hebrew terms, Nephilim, Anakim, Gibborim, carry meanings that shift between fallen ones, long-necked and mighty. The scriptural vocabulary, shaped by translation and commentary, supplies the foundation for centuries of speculation. It is this ambiguity, embedded in the earliest sources, that allows the Nephilim to serve as both a mythic warning and a template for interpreting later archaeological puzzles. Legends of giant beings surface far beyond the boundaries of the biblical world. In the Mediterranean, Sardinia's parish records from 1867 mention a skeleton of extraordinary size, uncovered in a churchyard, displayed briefly, then gone by mourning. Local correspondence from that period describes the remains as so large that villagers traveled from neighboring towns to see them, only for the bones to vanish without official explanation. Malta and Egypt preserve similar stories, where elongated skulls or outsized skeletons were reportedly discovered during church renovations or tomb clearances, then quietly removed or reburied by clerical order. On Catalina Island off the California coast, a field party in the 1920s documented a skeleton said to exceed 9 feet in length. The field notes list the bones and associated artifacts, but the specimen itself, shipped to the Smithsonian, disappears from subsequent inventories. No accession number, no display, and no published study. The only surviving trace is a brief mention and correspondence between the field director and the institution's registrar, referencing dental anomalies and unusual bone thickness. In Tennessee, 19th century burial mound excavations yielded skulls with dental patterns described as double rows of teeth, a trait echoed in scattered reports from West Virginia and even Vanuatu. While mainstream anthropology attributes these cases to developmental variation or post-mortem distortion, the motif of double rows recurs in field diaries and local folklore, often paired with claims of exceptional stature. Across these regions, the motif endures. Bones that do not match local populations, burial sites that yield outlier remains, and a pattern of disappearance or incomplete documentation. Each account stands alone, yet together they form a patchwork of claims that resist easy dismissal. The persistence of these stories, recorded in parish logs, field notes, and oral tradition, prepares the ground for closer scrutiny, raising questions about what can be explained by cultural practice and what remains unresolved when the evidence itself goes missing. Physical anthropology offers a set of established tools for interpreting unusual skeletal finds, but the limits of these methods are as important as their strengths. In the case of the Paracas skulls, artificial cranial deformation, practiced by binding an infant's head with boards or cloth, can create dramatic changes in shape without increasing the actual volume of the brain case. Peer-reviewed studies of similar Andean specimens show that while head binding can stretch the vault and alter its profile, it does not add bone or expand internal capacity. Measurements from global samples indicate that cranial volume remains stable, and any increase rarely exceeds 5 centimeters in circumference, or 20% in mineral weight. These findings are echoed by Dr. Melissa S. Murphy, a forensic anthropologist who has examined both Peruvian and global examples. She notes that the most extreme deformations are still within the boundaries of normal human variation, and that bone mass, density, and suture patterns follow predictable patterns tied to age and sex. Stature estimation relies on complete long bones, not impressions or artifacts. Disarticulation after burial, where vertebrae separate and soft tissue decays, can inflate height calculations by several centimeters. But this effect is minor compared to the claims of 9-foot individuals. Osteometric tables, when applied to the curated bones from Lovelock Cave and other sites, consistently place the tallest individuals within the known upper range for their populations. Even in cases where oversized sandals or robust tools are found, the skeletons themselves do not match the proportions implied by these objects. Bone mass can increase over time due to mineralization, especially in arid or chemically active soils. However, the documented weight gain from such processes is modest, typically under 20%. The Paracas skulls, sometimes reported as 60% heavier, stand outside the expected range for both natural and artificial modification. Yet, without systematic peer-reviewed measurement and open access to the full collection, these figures remain points of contention, rather than established fact. Physical anthropology can explain much, but not every reported anomaly fits neatly within its models. Authenticating ancient DNA from archaeological remains demands strict laboratory protocols, especially when claims rest on a single result. Dr. Miriam P. D'Andrea, whose team specializes in ancient DNA authentication, notes that contamination must be kept below 2% for any finding to be considered credible. In the case of the Paracas skulls, the only published mitochondrial result, haplogroup U2E, came from a bone sample processed under clean room conditions. The laboratory followed standard procedures, including UV-irradiated surfaces, bleach-treated reagents, and multiple extraction blanks to monitor for modern DNA. Even so, the chain of custody for the sample has never been fully disclosed, and the data have not been released for independent review. Without access to the raw sequences and a clear record of sample handling, the result remains an outlier in the broader genetic landscape of pre-Columbian South America, where Native American haplogroups dominate all published datasets. Pathological gigantism, often cited as a possible explanation for oversized remains, has well-defined biological limits. Growth hormone disorders, such as pituitary adenomas, can produce individuals up to about 2.7 meters tall, as documented in both clinical and archaeological records. These cases are rare and always accompanied by skeletal markers of disease, thickened cranial bones, enlarged joints, and specific deformities. No published case has exceeded this threshold, and no complete skeleton from any Nephilim-attributed site matches the proportions implied by oral tradition or artifact size. The largest individuals ever verified by osteometric analysis fall within the known extremes of human variation, not outside it. The empirical ceiling is clear. DNA contamination can never be fully ruled out without open data, and pathological growth has a measurable upper bound. As Dr. D'Andrea observes, without access to the original material and full laboratory notes, the strongest claims remain untestable. This scientific impasse, where neither extraordinary genetics nor disease fully explains the anomalies, sets the stage for the deeper problem of missing records and restricted access that continues to frustrate definitive answers. Accession records are designed to provide a clear trail from field discovery to curated storage. Yet, when researchers trace the paperwork for anomalous remains, whether from Kanawha Valley, Catalina Island, or Lovelock Cave, they often encounter blank spots where continuity should exist. Digital audits of institutional ledgers, such as those maintained by the Smithsonian and the National Archives, reveal entire sequences of accession numbers that skip over entries tied to controversial shipments. For example, the Smithsonian's 19th century ledger shows a run from accession 23-118 to 23-120, with 23-119 corresponding to the 1883 Kanawha Valley consignment, absent from both the public database and internal inventory lists. In other cases, internal correspondence authorizes the receipt of human remains under a non-public storage directive, diverting material away from standard cataloging. These specimens are routed to off-catalog storage, bypassing the documentation protocols that govern the majority of archaeological collections. The result is a paper trail that appears intact up to the moment of institutional transfer, then dissolves into silence. Blank ledger ranges and non-public storage orders are not isolated to a single institution or era. Across multiple museums, digitized audits from the early and mid-20th century repeatedly flag missing or redacted accession entries for shipments described in surviving manifests. The mechanical process? Assigning, skipping, or withholding accession numbers creates a first layer of opacity, making it nearly impossible to verify the fate of remains once they pass into official custody. Policies intended to safeguard human remains often contain loopholes that complicate the fate of anomalous specimens. In the United States, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, requires museums and federal agencies to return remains to affiliated tribes, but enforcement is uneven. Some collections are quietly transferred or reburied without full documentation, especially when affiliation cannot be established. This practice, while legal, creates a gray zone where unclassified or ambiguous remains can be removed from public record with little oversight. In Europe, municipal disposal statutes have a similar effect. Sardinian and Maltese ordinances empower local authorities to dispose of unidentified or unclaimed human bones, especially when no direct descendant community is recognized. These legal mechanisms are not designed to erase evidence, but their application can result in the permanent loss of specimens that fall outside conventional classification. Mediterranean parish records from the 19th century describe bones of unusual size being interred, displayed, and then quietly removed under the authority of local councils. No surviving inventory explains their final disposition. Parallel gaps appear in repatriation compliance elsewhere. In the United States, the record of inventory and potential affiliation process sometimes results in the deaccessioning of remains that cannot be conclusively linked to any extant group. These bones may be stored off-catalog, transferred to non-public repositories, or, in rare cases, destroyed according to local policy. The absence of clear accession or disposal records means that once removed from official ledgers, these remains are effectively untraceable. Across jurisdictions, the combination of repatriation laws, municipal disposal codes, and silent deaccessioning forms an administrative labyrinth. Each step is legally sanctioned, yet together they create a persistent blind spot. The unresolved absence of these specimens is not simply an oversight, but a recurring feature of how institutions manage the boundaries of scientific knowledge. Today, the physical evidence remains elusive, while the archival gaps only grow wider. As each unexplained loss or missing record accumulates, the boundary between error and omission blurs. The unresolved disappearance of specimens challenges not just archaeology, but public trust in how history is kept and told. Some mysteries persist, not because answers are lacking, but because the questions themselves are quietly filed away.